Welcome to the Workflow Podcast. Many, many moons ago, the Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca said that life is not short if you know how to use it. He added that people are frugal with their money, but not so their time, which is the one thing it is right to be stingy with, because time, unlike money, cannot be earned back once you've spent it. He was right. We waste so much of our time at work, to the detriment of our professional goals, our health, our personal relationships, and our experience of life. My name is Steve Glaveski, and I'm the founder of Innovation Accelerator Collective Campus and the author of several books and numerous Harvard Business Review articles on all things productivity and performance at work. My mission with this show is to help you unlock your potential to do more great work in far less time, whether you're working as part of a team or flying solo, and to set you up for a richer life. If you enjoy this show, please like, share, and/or subscribe. And if you'd like to learn more about my work and connect with me online, visit steveglaveski.com. And now, on with the show. Hello there, beautiful worker bees, and welcome to episode number 2 in our series on the foundations of high performance and productivity, because let's face it, more activated turmeric in lieu of purpose, incentives, strengths alignments, and passion isn't going to save us. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. In the last episode, we touched on purpose. Today, we'll be talking about the I in the mnemonic PIPS, which is incentives. So that mnemonic was PIPS, purpose, incentives, passion, strengths. Now, it might be all well and good to do something you're passionate about, but after a prolonged period of time, if you're not generating any income, if you're not paying your bills, well, chances are you're probably not going to keep investing time into that thing, because your most basic fundamental human needs per Abraham Maslow, your physiological needs and your needs for safety, aren't being satisfied. So today we're going to talk all about the impact of incentives, both intrinsic incentives and extrinsic incentives, on our performance at work. So let's jump right into it. When it comes to human behavior, we are ultimately incentivized from a psychological perspective to pursue pleasure, that is to pursue a dangling carrot, or to avoid pain, that is to avoid sticks. So it's the whole carrots and sticks argument behind human behavior. Some like to argue that all we do is avoid discomfort, but there are ultimately numerous schools of thought, but at its core, it boils down to this core argument that we either pursue pleasure or avoid pain. Now let's kick things off with extrinsic incentives. So we're talking about material incentives that are in place to motivate people. So those incentives could extend to cash incentives, monetary. They could extend to, say, vouchers, such as, say, a $500 hotel voucher or something to that effect, and awards. Now that could simply be a public recognition at a town hall meeting that you are the employee of the month or something to that effect. It could even be as simple as an acknowledgement of someone's efforts in, say, a Slack channel, so that other people can see that particular acknowledgement. So it really depends on the individual and what their respective motivation is based on how much they value these different types of motivation. Now, let's dig into some of the science behind incentive programs at work. Now, a 2010 meta-analysis on the effects of incentives on workplace performance found a positive correlation between extrinsic motivators and performance. In fact, they found that a quote-unquote properly constructed incentive program actually increased performance by anywhere between 25 and 44%. Now, for those of you on YouTube, you can see the table here, and you can see that monetary incentives were more than twice as effective as non-monetary tangible incentives, such as vouchers, in terms of incentivizing that positive performance at work, that behavior at work. The team, interestingly, argued for individual incentives over team incentives. And now this is pretty obvious when you think about it. In many organizations where you have, say, an overall sales target, it's easy for some of the sales reps to kind of loaf, to engage in what the researchers called social loafing, and basically ride everybody else's coattails. But when you have individual incentives, it motivates people to perform, and it also exposes people who are underperforming so you can take corrective action accordingly. The researchers of this particular study by the International Society of Performance Improvement, or ISPI, if I can call them that, also concluded that incentives increase employee persistence by 27% and mental effort by 26% on existing tasks. So remember, in the previous episode, I talked about persistence and how few things will take the place of persistence, and how having meaning behind our work is one way to keep getting up in the morning in the face of adversity. But these researchers also find that extrinsic incentives, having a well-constructed performance incentive program in place, also helps improve employee persistence by 27%, which is a significant number. Now, when I use that term well-constructed or properly constructed incentive program, what do I actually mean? Or what, rather, did the researchers mean in this case? Well, they found that just throwing out an incentive program isn't enough. It needs to meet 5 key conditions in order to be effective. Now, those conditions were: 1, the current performance of employees is inadequate. 2, the cause of that inadequacy is due to a deficiency in motivation. 3, the desired performance can actually be quantified. So, if I'm a sales representative, the performance can be quantified based on how much monetary value I bring to the organization, how many deals I close, what the value of those deals is, how many meetings I have, how many leads I pump through the CRM, and so on. Number 4, the goal is challenging but achievable. And that also aligns with the psychology of flow, the flow state, which I'm sure we'll cover at some point in this podcast. But essentially, flow, we get to that space where we are kind of operating at the edge of our capabilities. If something is just within reach, we are motivated to reach it. If it's way beyond reach, we'll get disgruntled because it will be way beyond our capabilities. And if it's far too easy, well, we'll get bored and won't be all that engaged. So it's a matter of engaging people, but also incentivizing them in a way whereby the goal is challenging, but not unattainable. And the 5th condition for success was essentially that the desired behavior does not conflict with organizational goals. So it doesn't create conflict of interest between, say, the individual and the goals of the team. That's a really important one. I mean, a classic example I can think of here is if Airbnb were to incentivize people purely based on nights booked at the expense of nights returned. So if you think about that metric, you can game that metrics. And there is actually a law on this. I believe it's called Goodhart's law, that as soon as a measure becomes an incentive, it ceases to be a good measure, or something to that effect. So if I was, say, looking at Airbnb and I was incentivizing people to increase nights booked, but they were doing so at the expense of nights returned, they could just game that by spending a ton of money on ads. But if the experience that guests had at these particular Airbnb locations was poor, they're unlikely to come back, they're likely to leave negative reviews, they're likely to tell people not to use Airbnb. So we need to ensure that those incentives aren't in conflict with other goals of the organization. In the case of Airbnb, long-term growth, success, and customer satisfaction. So that was one study, but there's a whole body of evidence on the effectiveness of incentives at work. Another study published in 2001, in fact, by the Society of Incentive and Travel Executives, let's just call them SITE, found that 8% of workers surveyed in this particular study said they would have achieved those goals without an incentive program. Only 8% of people said they would have achieved the same outcomes without an incentive program. These findings echo the previous study in terms of the impact on performance at work. The site study found that programs targeting individuals increased their performance by 27%, and programs targeting teams increased the performance of those teams by 45%. Now, while the ISPI study found 5 conditions for success when it comes to incentive programs, the site study found 2 more. Now, we'll call it the 6th condition for success, and that was that long-term incentive programs are more powerful than short-term programs. And number 7, that incentive programs structured with employee input work best. And I think that's just something that holds true across the board when it comes to wanting to get people's buy-in. If you want to get people's buy-in and you want them to really support what you're trying to do, getting them involved is a good place to start. And that's true of incentive programs. It's true of getting buy-in to, say, run an innovation program. It's true of personal relationships as well. Hey, I want to go on a holiday to Hawaii, so I'm going to book that. I'm going to book the surfing retreat, and then I'm going to tell my girlfriend, well, maybe I should have that conversation with her first. Moving on to a study out of Dortmund, great place in the world, have a fantastic football team, the Borussia Dortmund, with the Südtribune, one of the best and most colorful, most loud, boisterous supporters on the European continent. I love going out to Germany, but nonetheless, I digress. Their International School of Management in Dortmund actually found that extrinsic rewards also incentivize creativity and innovation, but, and this is a key but, only if it's clear why the work needs to happen in the first place. So this comes back to our previous point in the previous episode about purpose. So oftentimes, one of these variables alone isn't enough to motivate people. As I indicated in the previous episode, when it comes to purpose, purpose is great, but people still need to be able to act on that purpose, to deliver on that mission. If they don't, they'll just feel disgruntled and won't feel that connection between their work and the outcomes of the organization, which isn't very motivating. And similarly here, the Dortmund School of Management also finds that it's all well and good to incentivize people, but they need to understand the underlying why. A 4th study by Cornell University on incentives in the retail sector also found that performance-based incentive programs are associated with an increase in sales that persist and increase over time. They found something that game theorists will find interesting, and that is the fact that, and perhaps not all that surprising really, that permanent employees will outperform temporary employees when it comes to the efficacy of the incentive programs on their performance. And this is because if I'm a permanent employee in the retail space, I'm a lot more incentivized to build long-term relationships with customers, which will translate into future sales. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably familiar with Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton's research on the connection between income and happiness, and subjective well-being, really. I mean, they found that emotional well-being rises with income, but only up to about $75,000 per year per person, after which point there is no strong correlation there. High income results in life satisfaction or improves life satisfaction, but not necessarily happiness as such. Now, a separate study, which is quite related to Kahneman's research, was performed only 2 years ago by Steve Ford. Now, they found, or Steve and his team found, that we tend to base a lot of our subjective well-being on comparisons with peers. Now, me personally, I try to shy away from that. I don't think it's healthy. I think you should run your own race, because comparison is ultimately the thief of joy, and perhaps that's a deeper philosophical topic we'll explore in another episode. But they did find that our subjective well-being is based on comparisons with our peers, and that if we feel we are adequately incentivized based on our comparisons with our peers, more money won't necessarily motivate us more. So if we are a high-paid person, we're paid as well, if not better than our peers, how do we where do we find motivation from? Well, this aligns with Dan Pigg's research or Dan Pigg's book on Drive. That's when we start to turn inwards towards those intrinsic motivators. So I mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the previous episode. Again, it applies here. Once our basic needs are fulfilled, turns out that we derive a lot more motivation from those intrinsic motivators like autonomy, purpose, learning, and growth than we do from simply making more money. In fact, some research on this essentially backs that argument. This is Steve Ford's research, where they essentially found that for top-tier employees, purely cash incentives didn't actually serve as a motivator. In some cases, they were demotivating, which is interesting. So if you are constructing performance incentive programs at your company and you're listening to this, well, perhaps there is something to be said about not just thinking about money and bonuses, but how can you help people reach their more intrinsic goals? How can you help them learn and grow? Where do they want to get to? How do you help them derive more meaning from their work, reach a point of self-actualization and self-transcendence, and do more work that really makes them feel like they're making a positive contribution to the world? Because that is really what it comes down to once we surpass that $75,000 per year per person mark that Kahneman and Deaton found in their work. Now, a lot of this stuff comes back to something that Naval Ravikant, the millionaire tech entrepreneur behind AngelList, once tweeted, which is that you play the game, or the reason to play the game is to win it. Well, the reason to win the game, rather, is to be free of it. So we play the game to win the game so we can be free of it. So once you've got enough money in the bank, you've got your basic needs fulfilled, you can then work towards self-transcendence, finding meaning, finding inner peace, and not being at the mercy of the game as such and the eternal comparisons which can rob us of joy until the day we die. It's about pursuing those higher order goals and really living in the present moment. And I'm sure I'll cover that in a separate episode, but I guess we can conclude from this research that incentive programs do indeed improve performance at work, both extrinsic and intrinsic incentive programs. So rather than see those as binary, we should see them as working in tandem. They both influence employee motivations. And just because you make more than $75,000, this is not a call to managers everywhere to stop paying people more than $75,000. No, not at all. But it is a call to really pay more attention to those intrinsic motivators, particularly for emerging generations, Gen Z, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, Gen Y as well. And I know from my own work, like I've worked on stuff in the past that was really motivating in terms of the underlying purpose behind what we were doing. But for whatever reason, external factors, internal factors, we just could not get these particular projects to generate as much income as was required to really justify continuing to work on them. And so after a certain point, you have to throw in the towel. So incentives definitely play a factor. And like I said, we're talking about the foundations of high performance now, really the base layer in a cheesecake, that cookie, biscuity, best bit of any cheesecake, really, as far as I'm concerned, is the base. And it so happens to be the same case when it comes to our performance, our productivity at work. Today was all about incentives. In the next session, we'll be talking all about passion. And passion is something that people have alluded to as being a flawed pursuit. You should pursue purpose instead of passion, some say. But I think, again, that's when people fall victim to seeing either or, when really, if you can pursue something you're passionate about, that you find meaning in, well, then you're definitely onto something good there. So that's a sneak peek of what's to come in the next episode of the Workflow podcast. Hope you've enjoyed this show, this episode, this installment. If you'd like to connect with me, you can do so online at stevegleveski.com. And as always, I'll have links to all of the studies mentioned in today's episode in the show notes. And of course, I'll be uploading these episodes to YouTube if you prefer to watch your podcasts instead of just listening to them. Well, that's it for me for Season 1, Episode 2 of the Workflow Podcast. Until next time, take care.